What would you do if one quiet morning on the Kansas plains you discovered a young nun hanging from an old oak tree at the edge of your land, still alive, gasping for breath, clutching a letter that could bring down an entire religious order? This is the story of Ethan Callahan, a grieving rancher who thought he had nothing left to give the world, until he found Sister Helena, a woman of faith betrayed by the very people she trusted most. A secret buried deep within the sacred walls of St. Augustine's monastery, and a conspiracy so dangerous that speaking out could cost her life. As Ethan races against time to protect her, he's forced to confront his own shattered faith and make a choice between silence and sacrifice. If you're drawn to stories of courage, betrayal, and redemption, make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will challenge everything you believe about mercy, justice, and the quiet courage it takes to do what's right, even when the world tells you to look away. Ethan Callahan thought he'd seen just about everything in his 30 years of ranching the windswept plains of western Kansas. He'd lived through blizzards that turned the prairie into a frozen hellscape, dust storms that swallowed the sun whole, and droughts that cracked the earth like old leather. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw hanging from the ancient oak tree at the far edge of his property. At first, in the pale gray light of dawn, it looked almost mundane, like someone had strung laundry across the gnarled branches that had weathered more storms than any man alive. But as his battered pickup truck bounced closer across the uneven terrain, dodging prairie dog holes and jutting rocks, a cold dread seeped into his bones. It wasn't laundry. A figure dressed in white robes swayed gently in the autumn wind, suspended by a thick rope cinched tight around the neck. Ethan's boot slammed down on the brake so hard his half-full coffee mug flew off the dashboard and exploded against the passenger door. His heart pounded like a wild colt in a corral, trying to kick its way free. In all his years of solitude on this remote ranch, bordered by endless wheat fields and the occasional coyote den, he'd never expected to see something so terrible, so out of place, so deeply wrong. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the old monastery St. Augustine's sat another 10 beyond that, tucked in a valley where the Smoky Hill River carved through limestone bluffs. Whatever had happened out here, it wasn't an accident. Ethan grabbed his rifle from the rack behind his head and stepped out, his worn cowboy boots crunching on frost-bitten buffalo grass. October mornings in Kansas could be deceptive, starting out with a chill that bit to the bone, only to warm to a blazing heat by noon. But this wasn't the kind of chill you shook off with the sunrise. This one sank deeper into marrow and memory, and whispered of something ancient and cruel. As he drew closer, he saw the crude wooden sign hung around the figure's chest letters, painted in what looked like dried blood. God won't forgive the wicked. The words struck Ethan like a branding iron pressed to bare skin. Not just because of their blasphemous venom, but because they ripped open old wounds. Grace, his late wife, had taught him that God's mercy was infinite even for the worst sinner. She used to read scripture aloud by lamplight until cancer stole her voice, her faith steady even as her body failed her. But standing here with that message scrawled in blood, Ethan felt a crack in the foundation she'd built in him. Then he noticed something that stopped him cold. The chest was rising and falling, barely perceptible, but there, alive. This wasn't a corpse swaying in the wind like some macabre scarecrow. Someone was still breathing. Ethan dropped his rifle and ran, hands shaking, boots slipping on frost. The figure was smaller than he'd thought, delicate even. Beneath the white fabric of what he now recognized as a nun's habit, a pale face surfaced, paler than Kansas limestone. Her lips were tinged blue, her eyelids fluttering weakly when his calloused hand brushed her arm. She didn't have long. Ethan carried the young nun into his farmhouse like she was made of glass, every step careful, every movement deliberate. She felt impossibly light in his arms, a fragile bird battered by a storm, her body trembling with a cold that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the autumn air outside. The angry red welts around her neck were a stark reminder of how close she'd come to death. He laid her gently on the old leather couch, its cracked surface worn smooth by years of use and grief. Grace used to sit there every evening with her Bible reading by lamplight, as if her words could hold the world together. Now the same couch cradled a woman whose faith had been shattered so completely that Ethan wondered if even God himself could piece her soul back together. The nun, Sister Helena, she'd whispered when he asked her name, clutched something tight against her chest beneath her heavy habit. Her eyes darted around the room like a cornered deer searching for exits, for danger, for mercy. When Ethan brought her a glass of water, she flinched as though he might strike her. He froze mid-step, raising his weathered hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe here," he said softly, though his voice cracked in the quiet. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you under my roof." Sister Helena's dark eyes locked on his for a heartbeat, and in that moment, Ethan saw more than fear. He saw devastation, a soul hollowed out by betrayal, so deep it seemed to echo in her very being. When she finally spoke, her voice was no stronger than the rustle of dead leaves on a Kansas fence line. "I'm not worthy," she murmured, clutching the bundle tighter. "I failed my vows. I failed him." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd seen broken spirits before, wild horses whipped into submission, stray dogs that cowered at a raised hand. But this was different. This wasn't just fear. It was despair, deep and corrosive, eating away at her from the inside. As the morning light shifted across the hardwood floor, Sister Helena's death grip on the bundle eased slightly. For the first time, Ethan glimpsed what she was protecting, a crumpled letter, sealed with the insignia of St. Augustine's monastery. Black ink stained the paper with elegant script, but the words he caught made his stomach clench. Silence must be maintained, for the greater good of the church. Ethan's fists tightened at his sides. Whoever had done this didn't just want to scare her. They wanted her erased. She looked at him, then tears spilling down her bruised cheeks. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Not until I'm gone." And for the first time in 3 long years, Ethan felt his own faith stir, not in sermons or scripture, but in action. Before we dive deeper into the darkness surrounding Sister Helena and the deadly secret she uncovered, take a moment to support this channel. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this. Your support helps us bring you more stories that challenge the heart and stir the soul. Now let's get back to Ethan and find out just how far he's willing to go to protect her. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter Sister Helena had clutched like a lifeline. The seal of St. Augustine's monastery gleamed faintly in the golden afternoon light, its once holy symbol now twisted in his mind into something sinister. Outside, the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly silent, except for the rustle of dry grass and the mournful cry of a distant hawk. But inside, the air felt heavy, thick with unspoken fear. "They tried to kill me," Helena whispered, her voice hoarse, raw from hours of screaming that no one had heard. Her hands trembled violently as she wrapped Grace's old lavender-scented shawl tighter around her thin frame. Ethan's jaw clenched. He'd suspected cruelty, but hearing it in her own words made his blood run colder than a January wind. Why? Why would men of God do this? Helena's eyes flicked to the letter on the table, then back to him. She swallowed hard. "Because I found out what they've been hiding." The words spilled from her lips like floodwaters breaking a dam. She spoke of secret ledgers hidden in locked filing cabinets, of donations meant for the poor, siphoned into private accounts of Father Malcolm the Abbot himself, standing at the center of a web of greed that stretched far beyond the monastery's ivy-covered walls. "I thought if I showed him the evidence, he'd stop it," she said, her voice cracking like thin ice. I thought he'd want to set things right. But Ethan didn't need her to finish the thought. He could see the rest in her haunted eyes. Instead of confession and repentance, Father Malcolm had turned on her like a rattlesnake, his mask of piety slipping to reveal the cold predator beneath. Helena described how they locked her in her cell for days, whispering threats through the door. How they tried to break her spirit with prayers turned into weapons. How when she refused to surrender the documents, they decided to make an example of her. They put the rope around my neck, she said, tears streaking her pale cheeks. They told me God would forgive me if I let go. But I couldn't. Her hands gripped the shawl tighter. I couldn't let them keep stealing from the people who trusted them. Ethan felt something deep inside him stir a slow rising anger that burned hot enough to thaw even the icy grief that had frozen his heart since Grace's death. You're not safe here, he said finally, his voice low but steady. Helena's head jerked up, fear flashing in her dark eyes. Not because of me, Ethan said. Because they'll come looking. He nodded toward the window where long shadows stretched across the prairie like reaching fingers. And when they do, they won't ask questions. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the creak of the old farmhouse settling in the wind. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan's weathered hands closed around the letter, his knuckles white. We run, he said, and we don't stop until we find someone who can burn them to the ground. Before we continue with Ethan and Sister Helena's desperate escape across the Kansas plains, take a moment to support this story. If this tale has gripped your heart so far, don't forget to hit the like button. Leave a comment about what you'd do in Ethan's place and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss how it all unfolds. Your engagement helps us bring you more stories of courage, betrayal, and redemption. Now let's get back to the journey and see how far they'll go to outrun the darkness chasing them. Ethan killed the headlights as the old pickup rumbled through the back pasture following a narrow cattle trail he'd known since boyhood. Moonlight spilled across the Kansas prairie, silvering the tall grass and casting shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like restless spirits. Beside him in the passenger seat, Sister Helena sat rigid, clutching her letter, and the small bag Ethan had hastily packed bottled water crackers and one of Grace's old sweaters, still faintly scented with lavender. Her fingers twisted the fabric as if it could shield her from the memory of the rope of Father Malcolm's cold eyes, of whispered threats in the dark. Behind them, the glow of distant headlights swept across the horizon. They're looking for us, Helena murmured, her voice barely audible over the truck's low growl. They won't stop. They'll have to find us first, Ethan said, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. His jaw was set, the muscles in his face hard as carved stone. They drove in silence for the first hour, winding through back roads Ethan had memorized over decades of harvests and cattle drives. To an outsider, the endless prairie might look like an empty wasteland. But to Ethan, it was a map of memories, an abandoned grain elevator. Here a bent cottonwood tree, there, each landmark a waypoint in the journey to safety. Occasionally, Helena would glance nervously at the rearview mirror, as though expecting to see black sedans emerging from the night like wolves. But the roads remained empty, save for the occasional semi-truck hauling freight between Kansas City and Denver. Ethan's mind churned with questions he couldn't yet voice. Why hadn't she gone to the sheriff, to the bishop? But deep down, he already knew the answer. Whatever was festering inside St. Augustine's monastery wasn't confined to its ivy-covered walls. It reached farther its roots, twisting through county offices, courtrooms, and maybe even the sheriff's department itself. As the first streaks of dawn painted the sky in muted shades of lavender and gray, the lights of Kansas City glittered faintly on the horizon. We're close, Ethan murmured. Once we reach the FBI field office, they'll take it from there. But Helena didn't look reassured. Her hands tightened around the letter until the paper crumpled. You don't know them like I do. They, they'll find me, even there. Ethan glanced at her, seeing not just fear in her eyes, but exhaustion, soul-deep weariness of someone who had been running long before he found her. Then let them come, he said quietly, his voice like gravel. But they'll have to get through me first. The FBI field office in Kansas City rose like a gray fortress of steel and glass, its hard edges cutting through the morning haze. To Ethan, it felt like stepping into another world, far from the windswept plains, the creaking farmhouse, and the ancient oak where he'd found Sister Helena clinging to life. Helena's steps were small and hesitant as they walked the long hallway flanked by federal agents in dark suits and earpieces. She clutched the letter to her chest like a shield, her knuckles pale, her eyes darting toward every sound. Even here, she didn't feel safe. Special Agent Naomi Reyes, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the calm authority of someone who had seen her share of horrors, greeted them in a glass-walled conference room. She studied Helena with quiet intensity, offering a cup of tea that went untouched. "You're safe now," Reyes said softly, though her voice carried an edge of steel. "No one from St. Augustine's will get to you here." But Helena shook her head, her voice still a tremor. "You don't understand. They have people everywhere, even in law enforcement." Reyes exchanged a glance with the other agents, her jaw tightening. "That's why you came to us." For the next 3 hours, Helena spoke. The words spilled from her lips in a torrent about Father Malcolm. The hidden accounts, the threats, the locked cell door. Her story painted a chilling portrait of a conspiracy rooted not just in greed, but in spiritual corruption, a desecration of everything she had once believed sacred. Reyes listened without interruption, her pen moving quickly across a legal pad. When Helena finally fell silent, exhausted and trembling, Reyes picked up the letter and leafed through the attached photocopies. Bank transfers, ledgers, handwritten notes. "This," Reyes said, tapping the evidence with a manicured finger, "is enough to bring the whole operation down." The arrests began 3 days later, like dominoes toppling in precise order. Father Malcolm was led away from morning prayers in handcuffs, his expression a mask of cold rage. The county judge, Judge Harrington, was pulled from his chambers in front of stunned clerks. 2 senior priests and a diocesan official followed, their secrets crumbling under the weight of federal indictments. 2 weeks later, Ethan returned to his ranch. It looked the same, the golden fields, the creaking windmill, but he felt different, like he was seeing it through new eyes. There was a letter waiting in his mailbox, no return address, postmarked from a small town in the Rockies. "Dear Mr. Callahan, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. I'm safe now, teaching children, trying to find my faith again. You didn't just save my life, you reminded me that good still exists in this world. May God bless you always." Helena. Ethan folded the letter carefully and stepped onto the porch. The prairie wind brushed his face, warm and gentle. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, not grief, not anger. Peace. At its heart, this story is not just about corruption or survival. It is about the quiet, uncelebrated courage of ordinary people who choose to do what's right even when the cost is staggering. Ethan Callahan, a grieving rancher who had every reason to turn away, instead risked everything to save a fragile life hanging, literally and figuratively, by a thread. Sister Helena, though, broken and betrayed by the very institution she devoted her life to, found the strength to speak the truth and confront the darkness festering within her sacred walls. Together, they remind us that redemption often comes not from grand gestures, but from small acts of humanity, a hand reaching to cut a rope, a voice whispering, "You're safe now," a decision to stand against the tide of fear. The story's most profound impact lies in its emotional touchpoints. the raw terror of a young woman persecuted for her integrity, the quiet resilience of a widower rediscovering his faith in people, and the universal longing for justice in a world that so often rewards silence. It forces us to confront questions about complicity and courage. What would we do if protecting truth meant endangering ourselves? Would we have the strength to save someone else, even when we couldn't save those we loved before? Ultimately, this is a tale about mercy and moral responsibility. It challenges us to believe that even in a landscape as empty and vast as the Kansas plains, there are still places where goodness can take root and people willing to protect it at any cost. This was just the first chapter of Ethan and Helena's fight for justice. But their journey is far from over. Watch the next video to discover the sacrifices they'll have to make and the courage it takes to stand against evil when the whole world tells you to stay silent. Your next story is waiting. Click now.